20 hectares, then 400, then 1,400. At 11:01 a.m. on April 3, 2026, the ignition point was a mere coordinate on a topographic map near the West Side Road corridor in British Columbia's Okanagan Valley. By 1:30 p.m., the Skaha-West Fire had reached 600 hectares, an area larger than Vancouver's Stanley Park, incinerated in less than 150 minutes. By 4:30 p.m., the footprint exploded to 1,415 hectares. By 7 p.m., the total sat at 1,690 hectares, with 0% containment. That rate of growth, roughly 34 hectares per hour across an entire afternoon, is not a statistical anomaly. It is a breakdown of the seasonal safety net. In the interior of British Columbia, April is supposed to be the buffer. It is the bridge between the spring melt and the summer heat, the narrow window when the undergrowth still holds enough residual winter moisture to prevent a spark from becoming a geography. But right now, what scientists are seeing in the automated snow weather station data changes everything. This is not a slow burn crisis. It is happening in real time, and the infrastructure of the Pacific Northwest is not prepared for a fire season that begins before the tulips bloom. Marcus Chen looked out his window in the Kettle Valley neighborhood of Kelowna and saw a sky that had turned a bruised, sickly copper before the first emergency alert even hit his phone. He thought the houses 3 doors down were already crowning. They weren't. Not yet. The fire was still 5 kilometers away, screaming across the ridges of the Myra-Bellevue corridor at the speed of the wind, 90 kilometers per hour through the mountain passes. This is the story of a province that told itself the drought was over and is now watching its landscape vanish in April. The sky was brown over the Thompson Okanagan before most residents understood that the mountains were no longer protected by the ghost of winter. At 12:26 p.m., just 85 minutes after the Skaha-West ignition, the Nikola fire ignited near Merritt. 2 fires, 2 regional districts, 1 afternoon. The wind was the story the survivors told, but the science tells a darker tale of stored thermal energy and a missing hydraulic shield. The California-style megafire has officially migrated north, and the seasonal clock has been shattered. 2 days before the smoke choked the valley, engineers from the British Columbia Ministry of Water, Land and Resource Stewardship drove to the Blackwell Peak snow course in E.C. Manning Provincial Park. They pushed their aluminum sampling tubes into what should have been a deep crystalline archive of the winter's precipitation. The result was a chilling silence. The measurement was 18% of the historical average. In the North Thompson, it plummeted to 6%. This was the second lowest snowpack in the history of the provincial record. The paradox was the cruelty. British Columbia had been declared officially drought-free in January 2026. For the first time in a generation, the hydrometeorological maps showed no deficit across the entire province. The snowpack, however, told a different story, one of a thermal regime shift that the monitoring systems were only beginning to categorize. This is not just a report on a fast-moving fire. It is the post-mortem of a geographical system that called itself recovered while it was fundamentally broken. The technical breakdown of the Skaha-West Fire begins with the atmospheric pressure gradient. At 11:01 a.m. on April 3rd, the fire was reported at 20 hectares on the steep timbered slopes above Skaha Lake. By 1:30 p.m., the British Columbia Wildfire Service (BCWS) automated sensors recorded a growth to 600 hectares. An area larger than the downtown core of Kelowna had been consumed in less than 150 minutes. The rate of spread was fueled by a geophysical phenomenon known as the Venturi effect. The Okanagan Valley acts as a massive natural wind tunnel, compressing and accelerating airflow from the high plateau of the interior down toward the border. On that Friday, Environment and Climate Change Canada ECCC, recorded sustained gusts of 85 km per hour. To the crews on the ground, the fire wasn't just burning, it was being vacuum-fed. By 4:30 p.m., the total had reached 1,415 hectares. By 7 p.m., 1,690 hectares. That rate of growth, an average of 34 hectares per hour, is not normal April fire behavior. April is a seasonal fail-safe, the window where the weak layer of the landscape, the organic duff and fine fuels, is supposed to be saturated with meltwater. Dr. Elena Rossi, a lead hydrologist at the Pacific Geoscience Center, explained the failure in a leaked internal memo. The rain that eliminated the drought fell as liquid, not solid. It soaked into the topsoil and ran into the reservoirs. It did not accumulate in the high elevation alpine. When the record heat of March arrived, it burned off what little snowpack remained, leaving no thermal buffer. The vegetation above 1,000 meters dried 60 days ahead of schedule. At 12:26 p.m., only 85 minutes after the Skaha ignition, the Nikola fire ignited near Merritt, just off the Coquihalla Highway. A second evacuation zone, a second multi-agency response. BC Wildfire Services smoke advisories covered Penticton, Summerland, Pittsland, and West Kelowna by mid-afternoon. The Canadian Wildfire Emergency Fund, a multi-billion-dollar federal reserve, had already been tapped for the first time during the early season Horsefly Lake fire in January 2025. David McLaren, an energy analyst at a Vancouver firm, stated, "We are entering a cycle where the financial safety nets are being triggered in months that used to be designated for flood prep, not fire suppression." The current balance of the reserve is a state secret, but the burn rate, both of the land and the money, is unsustainable. The interval between the Horsefly Lake fire and the Skaha-West event was a mere 14 months. The April 1st snow survey confirmed the geophysical reality with a number. April 3rd confirmed it with a wall of flame. At the Regional Emergency Operations Center, monitoring screens showed the fire jumping the KVR trail, a reinforced fire break, as if it didn't exist. The stored fire suppression of the snowpack was gone. In its place was a desiccated landscape where the soil moisture was already at July levels. The monitoring data from Natural Resources Canada showed that the drought-free status was a superficial lie. The deep layer soil moisture was at a critical deficit. The system was primed for a catastrophic energy release, and all it needed was a spark and the wind. There is a particular kind of false security that a contained fire produces. It is the psychological belief that because the system held today, the architecture of the landscape will hold tomorrow. But as of 7 p.m., while the Skaha-West fire sits at 25% containment, the geophysical data suggests we are not at the end of an incident, but at the beginning of a seasonal collapse. To understand the gravity of April 2026, we must look at the precedent that maps most directly onto this crisis, the catastrophic summer of 2021. That winter was considered dry by historical standards, but by today's metrics, it was a reservoir of moisture. On April 1st, 2021, the statewide snowpack in British Columbia sat at 59% of the average, low enough for the River Forecast Center to issue early warnings, but not perceived as a death knell. By June, the heat dome arrived, a high-pressure atmospheric block that functioned like a thermal lid over the interior. On June 30th, the village of Lytton was erased from the map in a matter of minutes. The structures were not merely burned, they were vaporized by a fire that moved with the velocity of a landslide. In 2021, the snowpack was at 59%. Today, at the Blackwall Peak Station, it is 18%. The mechanics of this failure are rooted in a coupled system of atmospheric physics and geomorphology. The Okanagan Valley is not just a scenic corridor. It is a tectonic rift valley, a deep structural scar in the Earth's crust bounded by the Okanagan Valley fault system. This geography creates a natural flume. When high-pressure systems in the Alberta prairies collide with low-pressure cells off the Pacific coast, The air is forced through these narrow, granite-walled trenches. It compresses, it accelerates, it becomes a force of nature that firefighters call the blowtorch. In the 2023 McDougall Creek fire near West Kelowna, this exact mechanism allowed embers to jump 2 kilometers across the lake, igniting the eastern shore. That fire consumed 13,000 hectares and destroyed 190 structures. But that happened in August. The Springs fire, now renamed the Skaha-West complex, is doing the same thing in early April. The weak layer here isn't found in a snowpack on a mountain peak, but in the moisture-starved cells of the ponderosa pine and sagebrush. Under normal conditions, the glacial lacustrine silts and terraces that line the valley would be saturated with meltwater until at least June. This ground moisture buffer is the only thing that prevents the interior from becoming a permanent ignition zone. But according to the Geological Survey of Canada, GSC, groundwater monitoring wells, the water table in the southern interior has dropped to levels not seen since the Great Dust Bowl era. The historical parallel that haunts the current incident command is the Donny Creek fire of 2023. It started as a manageable cluster of lightning strikes in the northern boreal forest. It became a geography. By the time it was held, it had consumed over 570,000 hectares, larger than the province of Prince Edward Island. It was a fire that redefined the scale of Canadian disaster response. But Donny Creek was a wilderness fire. The Skaha-West Fire is a wildland-urban interface, WUI fire. It is happening in a corridor home to over 360,000 people. The science of 2026 confirms a terrifying shift in the fire return interval. Traditionally, the forests of the Okanagan were shaped by low-intensity fires that cleared the understory every 15 to 30 years. Today, the interval has collapsed. Areas that burned in 2021 and 2023 are reburning in 2026. The vegetation has no time to reach maturity. Instead, it is being replaced by invasive, highly flammable grasses that ignite at the slightest friction. Carla Neoth, a lead researcher with the Canadian Forest Service, calls this the desiccation feedback loop. As the snowpack fails, the soil dries. As the soil dries, the local humidity drops. As the humidity drops, the fire intensity increases. At the regional command center in Kamloops, the screens are tracking more than just flames. They are tracking harmonic tremors of a different sort, the pulse of a power grid under extreme stress. The Skaha-West Fire is currently moving toward the primary 500 kilovolt transmission lines that feed the lower mainland. If those lines fail, the economic heart of British Columbia, the port of Vancouver, will be crippled. The system is coupled. The fire in the forest is a fire in the supply chain. The April 1st survey gave us a number. April 3rd gave us a casualty list. The season has 8 months left, and the thermal energy stored in the dried-out timber of the Monashi and Selkirk Mountains is equivalent to a geological pressure cooker with no relief valve. The sky above the Skaha Hills neighborhood didn't just darken, it solidified into a wall of opaque, particulate-heavy amber. Frank Desjardins, a retired civil engineer who had lived on the edge of the Myra Bellevue Park for 3 decades, stood on his deck with a garden hose, a futile, symbolic gesture against an atmospheric event. He watched the ridges, waiting for the familiar sight of the BC Wildfire Service bombers. When they arrived, they looked like toys against the scale of the convection column. "I thought the neighbors' houses were already gone," Frank later told a CBC reporter at the Kelowna Community Center. The heat wasn't just coming from the fire, it was coming from the air itself. It felt like the valley was being preheated. He wasn't entirely wrong. The San Gorgonio Pass equivalent here, the narrow chutes of the Monashi foothills, was channeling 55-knot winds directly into wood frame developments built at the wildland-urban interface, WUI. By 5 p.m., the Skaha Hills and Heritage Hills neighborhoods were under tactical evacuation. This was not a measured door-to-door notification. This was the RCMP using high decibel sirens and loudspeakers, telling residents they had 3 minutes to leave. The Gilman Springs Road equivalent, East Side Road, became a choked artery of SUVs, horse trailers, and service trucks. On one side of the asphalt, meticulously maintained lawns and $2 million views. On the other side, decades of accumulated fuel loads in a landscape that had forgotten the taste of snow. The WUI in the Okanagan is no longer a boundary. It is a point of failure where civilization has been built inside a natural chimney. The logistical strain is unprecedented for the first week of April. Chief Operations Officer Amandip Sidhu of the BC Wildfire Service reported that by late afternoon, 260 firefighters were committed to the Skaha-West complex alone. 36 engines and 10 air tankers, including the massive Colson Next Gen tankers, were pulled from maintenance hangars in Abbotsford and Kamloops to a single location in Riverside County's equivalent, the regional district of Okanagan-Similkameen. These are resources typically reserved for the campaign fires of late August. To deploy them in April is a logistical nightmare that depletes the provincial emergency budget before the fiscal year has even properly begun. The economic cost is a black hole. The Canadian Wildfire Reserve, modeled after international disaster funds, was activated for the first time during the Eaton Creek Fire in January 2025. That fire, which ignited during a midwinter windstorm near Kamloops, had already drained an estimated $4.2 billion Canadian dollars in insurance claims and provincial aid. Jack Buckley, a vice president at a leading Vancouver energy advisory firm, warned of the structural deficit. The system is not designed for a 12-month fire season. If we are spending $500 million a week on suppression in April, there will be nothing left when the lightning starts in July. The current balance of the British Columbia Wildfire Stabilization Fund has not been publicly disclosed, a silence that many analysts find more alarming than the smoke. For the families evacuated, the trauma is compounded by a sense of permanent displacement. The survivors of the 2025 Eaton Creek Fire are still not home. 14 months later, over 900 families in the interior are still living in temporary modular housing or with relatives. The Eaton Fire reduced houses not to shells, but to slabs, bare concrete foundations where the only things standing are the twisted, blackened frames of refrigerators and washing machines. Rebuilding permits are moving at a glacial pace, because the very ground they want to build on is now classified as a high-risk debris flow zone. The fire removes the vegetation. The rain, when it finally comes, removes the soil, and the bedrock is all that remains. The Skaha-West Fire is the same mechanism, arriving earlier and hitting harder. Maurice Williams, who has farmed orchard land near the hills for 20 years, watched the smoke from the Skaha Lake Marina. "We were told the drought was over in January," he said, his voice cracking over the sound of the wind. "We saw the rain in the valley, and we thought we were safe. But you look up at those peaks, and you see grey rock where there should be 3 meters of white. That grey rock is the reason my farm is going to burn." By 8 p.m., the fire had jumped the primary distribution lines. 45,000 customers in the southern interior lost power instantly. The cellular towers, lacking redundant thermal shielding for a fire of this intensity, began to fail. The Okanagan was plunged into a pre-digital darkness, illuminated only by the orange glow reflecting off the bottom of the smoke shelf. This is the reality of a coupled collapse. The failure of the snowpack leads to the desiccation of the forest, which leads to the destruction of the grid, which leads to the total isolation of a population that believed the winter had saved them. There is a particular kind of false security that a contained fire produces. The sense that because the system held this time, the infrastructure will hold the next. As the sun sets over the smoking ridges of the Skaha-West complex on April 3, 2026, the fire is listed at 25% containment. But in the war rooms of the British Columbia Wildfire Service and the emergency operations centers in Victoria, there is no celebration. The containment lines held for now, for this specific incident. But the vegetation profile that made today possible will not improve before the summer solstice. It will worsen day by day. Every hour that the April sun climbs higher in the sky, it siphons away the remaining soil moisture that would normally be replenished by a slow, methodical release from mountain snowmelt. But there is no snowmelt coming. The April 1st survey was a death warrant for the seasonal buffer. When the measurement at Phillips Station, remapped to the Blackwell course, read 18%, it didn't just signal a water shortage. It signaled the removal of the province's hydraulic shield. This is the coupled system collapse that geophysicists have feared, a winter that arrives with rain instead of snow, saturating the surface just enough to trick the sensors into declaring an end to the drought, while leaving the high-altitude reservoirs of ice empty. Without that ice, the interior of British Columbia becomes a tinderbox by mid-spring. Sean Peterson, a lead analyst at the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Centre, CIFFC, in Winnipeg, warned of this elevated risk across the western provinces as early as February. He pointed to the thermal depth the landscape was carrying. The April 1st survey gave that depth a number. April 3rd gave it an address: West Side Road, Kelowna, Central Okanagan. The risks moving forward are not confined to the forest. The vulnerability of the Canadian corridor is systemic. The Skaha-West Fire is burning within kilometers of the primary natural gas pipelines that heat the lower mainland and the high-voltage transmission lines that power the industrial heart of the province. If these fires become a permanent fixture of April and May, the maintenance windows for critical infrastructure disappear. We are looking at a future where the fire season is not a season at all, but a permanent state of atmospheric volatility. The Port of Vancouver, the busiest gateway in Canada, relies on the rail arteries of the CP and CN networks that snake through these very valleys. A single wind-driven event in the Thompson-Okanagan can effectively sever the national supply chain, marooning billions of dollars in cargo because a hillside in the interior reached its ignition point 2 months early. The financial fallout is equally inevitable. The Canadian Wildfire Fund, which covers the staggering liabilities of utility-started fires and mass evacuations, is an opaque ledger, but the math is unforgiving. If the province must mobilize 10 air tankers and hundreds of personnel for a small 1,600-hectare fire in April, the burn rate of the provincial treasury will exceed its capacity before the lightning storms of July even arrive. We are entering an era of disaster compounding, where the costs of the last fire are still being calculated when the next one ignites. The families in the Marina Valley equivalent, the Kettle Valley and Upper Mission neighborhoods, now live in a landscape where the wildland-urban interface has become a front line. The precedent of the 2021 Dixie Fire in the south, or the 2023 Donny Creek Fire in the north, shows us that once a fire moves from an incident to a geography, there is no stopping it with human technology. You can only hope to steer it. Dave Capuccilli, standing in his backyard in Penticton, wetting down his pergola with a garden hose, represents the entire defensive posture of a civilization built in a fire corridor. He is rinsing off embers, hoping to prevent the inevitable through sheer repetition. It is a microcosm of the provincial strategy, wetting down the edges while the core is already dry. California, or rather the climatic regime once associated with it, has moved north. The boundary is no longer the 49th parallel, it is the snow line, and that line is retreating. The story of April 3rd, 2026 is not just the story of two fires in the Okanagan and the Nicola Valley. It is the story of a state, a province, that called itself drought-free in January because the reservoirs were full of rain, while the mountains were empty of snow. The snowpack is not just water, it is time, and on April 3rd, British Columbia ran out of time. The fire started on April 3rd. The snowpack read 18%. The season has 8 months left. If this story of geophysical inevitability is worth telling, follow the data. We cover the evolution of these planetary shifts every week. Subscribe to stay ahead of the flame.